Welcome to the Writing Westward podcast. I'm your host, Brenden Rensink. On this episode, we have a conversation with Louis S. Warren, the author of the 2018 Bancroft Prize-winning book, God's Red Sun, The Ghost Dance Religion and the Making of Modern America. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. In each episode of this podcast, we host a conversation with an author or scholar of new work that explores the North American West. Disciplines will vary, the length of conversations will likely range dramatically, but we hope that each conversation will introduce you to new work, provoke as many questions as they provide answers, and inspire you to learn more about the North American West as a region, as well as its peoples, environments, histories, literature, and so forth. To learn more about the Redd Center, our programming, funding opportunities for research and events, find us at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's reddcenter.byu.edu. Follow Writing Westward on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or on Twitter at Writing West. You can find a list of podcast episodes and listen on the Redd Center website and clicking on the Writing Westward Podcast tab at the top of the page. You can also listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and various other podcast networks and distributors. Thanks for listening. It is not by accident that I chose this conversation and book as the inaugural podcast episode for Writing Westward. Both the book and the discussion with its author exceeded my very high expectations. Louis S. Warren is the W. Turrentine Jackson Professor of U.S. Western History at the University of California, Davis. His book, which we'll discuss today, God's Red Sun, The Ghost Dance Religion and the Making of Modern America, was published in 2018 by Basic Books and was the winner of the prestigious 2018 Bancroft Prize. In this book, Professor Warren offers one of the most comprehensive narrative treatments of the ghost dance religion. This movement began in the 1880s in Nevada when a Paiute man received visions of a Messiah and a renewed millennial world that would come if natives performed certain dances and lived by certain principles. The movement spread quickly across the continent and provides the historical backdrop and context for the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre, when the U.S. 7th Cavalry slaughtered hundreds of unarmed Lakotas who were adherents of the ghost dance. This event is often where popular understandings of the ghost dance religion end, but Professor Warren shows how it persisted for years after. While detailing this history and bringing many new sources to light, Warren also forwards a unique thesis, that the popular understanding of the ghost dance as a wholly backwards-looking movement intent on turning back the clock to a lost indigenous world might be completely wrong. To the contrary, Warren argues that the religion was a forward-looking and pragmatic faith that offered Native peoples a way to reconcile their heritage with present trials and to chart a confident path into the future while maintaining their indigenous identity in a modern world. The book is beautifully written. It's imbued with an empathy that I rarely see in academic scholarship. I think you will be able to hear Warren's passion in our conversation and the sincerity with which he approached this topic. Again, it was no accident that I chose to feature this book in the podcast's inaugural episode. Welcome, Professor Louis Warren, to the podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
We'll spend quite a bit of time with kind of the thesis and argument of your book, but before that, I wanted to kind of get a few preliminary questions out there. About 10 years ago, you gave what I believe was one of your first public lectures on this topic, here at the Redd Center, which means that you've been working on this for quite some time. And those not familiar with how books are written might be surprised, that we do sometimes take a decade or more on these things. But could you kind of tell us how it is that you first came to this topic?
Oh, how do you first come to the topic of the ghost dance? If you're doing the history of the American West, or if that's what you study, it's sort of always there. From the time I was a child and I read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, like so many others, where that book ends with the ghost dance. And the growing up and reading about American Indian history in textbooks, it was usually mentioned as the sort of end of Native history
Yeah.
in the United States. I mean, that's usually what happens in textbooks for people who are unfamiliar with them. Is we get to the 19th century, that they do something on the wars of the Indian wars on the plains, and then those things will end with the ghost dance, and then that's it. You often don't. You see little or no Native history for the rest of the American story. I mean, into the 20th century. That's often how those textbooks go. And so this was always on my mind, that the ghost dance was presented as a kind of ending of Indian history, which I knew couldn't be right because I knew Native people, and I was, of course, reading other books all along that suggest there's a great deal of history after the ghost dance moment. And so it's always been something that I found interesting. The other factor here is that I came from Nevada. I grew up in Nevada, and in the teachings or in what we learn about the ghost dance, from the sources we have, right? We learn that the prophecies came from a northern Paiute man named Wovoka, or also known as Jack Wilson, who lived in Nevada. And his teaching spread all over the West. And one of the things that always struck me was this was a story in part about someone from Nevada having this huge, huge impact. And yet I could never figure out how that was. That was usually not how the people came to hear his teachings out in the middle of the desert. It is often not part of the story, and I was very curious about that too.
But I think most people that know your work at least this is how I always thought of you, was as an environmental historian, and as kind of a Western cultural historian. So is this a topic that, as you were doing your books on conservation and poachers and your book on Buffalo Bill, well, was this something you've been thinking about? I mean, because it's not just that you had an interest, you decided to spend over a decade of your life pursuing this topic. Was there some moment where you thought, I think I'm going to sit down and make this the next decade of my life, researching and writing this book?
Well, I think that I first, one thing I should say is that all of my work, in my first book and my second book, has incorporated Native history into the other stories that I'm telling. So when I did the book when I wrote Hunter's Game, which is about the fights between local hunters and conservationists over who has access, who has the right to hunt in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There's a whole sequence of chapters there on Native people and their struggles with government regulations imposed on hunting. I spent a lot of time in that book talking to Blackfeet people and reading Blackfeet history, and that becomes the fight between Blackfeet people and Glacier National Park becomes a central part of that book. When I wrote the Buffalo Bill book, I did come across the ghost dance story again because it figures very prominently in the story of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, because after the ghost dance happens and after the Wounded Knee Massacre, the government, the army, arrested 23 or 24 of the so-called leaders of the ghost dance movement at Pine Ridge and put them in prison at Fort Sheridan. And they were offered the choice of either staying in prison for a year or going off with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show to Europe. And they most of them took the latter. Most of them went off with the Wild West show. And so their stories became part of the book that I wrote about Buffalo Bill. And so that again, that was another moment where I was doing something completely different from the ghost dance, and the ghost dance comes into that story. And it was just a sign to me of how ever present the ghost dance is in the history of the American West, and how essential it is to understanding other things. Now, in terms of why, how I came to spend 10 years writing the book, I guess it was about 10 years. I guess you're right there. It's one of those moments where you look back on and think, wow,
has that much
really
time really passed?
Long? Yes. And the thing is, you don't, at least I don't, decide to spend 10 years on a book. What happens is I say, I'm going to write this book really fast. I mean, this book is, I got this figured out.
Then life happens, right?
Yeah. Well, you sit down and you think you're going to take three years on a book or 4 years on a book. And first of all, yeah, life happens. I do a lot of other things in those years. But there's also the fact that the book just changed dramatically from the time that I first envisioned it to what it became. What happens is if you're doing it right, I think, right, as you do more research and turn up more things, your ideas change, which is, the reason we write books is to learn, not just to teach, right? We're writing books and teaching ourselves as we go along about what this history is. And the sources that I encountered in writing the book were not what I expected.
Mm-hmm. So it's always an exploration for the author as well.
Yeah.
The story is always more complex than you thought it was going to be, and more difficult to wrap your head around than you anticipated when you approached the project with what you thought was your rock solid thesis and interpretation, right?
Absolutely. I mean, when I started this book, it was supposed to be, and I think the talk that you heard, although all those years ago, was based on the idea of what the book was then, which was, it was supposed to be a book about. There is a moment in this book, you'll see it, where the prophet of the ghost dance meets the first anthropologist who comes out to interview him, who's sent out from the federal government, and they meet in the middle of the desert. And it's this great moment where this charismatic prophet, Jack Wilson or Wovoka, is having a conversation with this social scientist. And that moment of the sort of prophet and the social scientist, it signifies a lot of things about different ways of knowing the world, and this sort of strange encounter in the desert in 1892 in Nevada. And I sort of thought I would write a series of short essays about America in that moment, sort of circling around that encounter. And of course, the book became something completely different from that. That moment is in the book, but the book is very different from that now.
There have been a lot of studies of the ghost dance, and lots of books about Wounded Knee and other associated topics, but many of them have been much narrower in focus, perhaps focused, on Pine Ridge or other, more narrow geographies and time periods. And yours presents, really perhaps since that anthropologist, since Moody's work, one of the only kind of broad scale trying to tell the whole story, which is a major contribution. But beyond that, you also are arguing a provocative idea that not only does this story need to be told and talked about more, but that the way we've been telling it for all these decades and years is perhaps a little bit off base.
Right.
And that's where I eventually want this conversation to arrive at is what is the revision that you're offering. But can we first lay out, and actually some of this revision is probably going to come through as you lay this out, for those that don't kind of know the full story about what the ghost dance religion was, what was being preached and then observed in this movement, and then kind of the thumbnail sketch of where and when it started, and then how it and where it spreads to and when. Sure.
I mean, the ghost dance religion, and it comes, let me put it this way, it comes out of much older traditions in the Great Basin, beginning among northern Paiute people. There are these older traditions of apocalypse and renewal, the prophecies of the world ending, and then the world being reborn. And what comes to be known as the ghost dance religion of 1890, that religion begins as a sequence of prophecies that are issued by a man, again, Wovoka in northern Nevada. And they're taken up initially by northern Paiute people. And from there, the prophecies and the ritual ceremonial dance that accompanies those prophecies and teachings travels to other reservations, and it sweeps most of the West in 1889 and 90. And what the teachings consist of, typically in most of the history books, it says that the believers maintained the world would end, that white people would be eliminated, that Indians would inherit a new earth that would be remade and rejuvenated and revived, and it would once again be green and verdant, and that they would be able to go back to their old ways and live on this fully restored earth. And that in order for this to happen, the teaching said that the believers needed to do this dance, but also, again, this is as presented in most of the studies of the ghost dance that we have, the believers are told that they must be kind to one another, not lie, not steal, not make war, and in general be good people, live right. Mm-hmm. Right. And that this will happen. Right. And it's a peaceful movement. And then what happens in the course of things is that as the religion reaches the Lakota Sioux reservations in South Dakota, where it's met with a great deal of enthusiasm, the way the story typically goes is the army then moves in to crush this religion, in which people are turning in these dance circles very quickly, and there's a great deal of enthusiasm for it, and there are allegations that believers are putting on bulletproof shirts, what they claim are shirts that are bulletproof, and are plotting a rebellion. And the army then crushes this movement at Wounded Knee. I think most of our listeners will have heard the term Wounded Knee before. They will know that there was a massacre at Wounded Knee. What most people don't realize is that massacre was perpetrated because those Native people were ghost dancers. They were believers, and the army was out to crush that movement. Now, what did I have to add to that story?
I feel like I got a fairly good education in undergraduate and graduate school,
mm-hmm.
And I understood some of the complexities of this, but the general interpretation thereof is that it ends in 1890.
Yeah.
It was doomed to end because it was a backwards-looking movement.
Mm-hmm.
It was one that simply was incongruous and could not exist with the nation moving forward, and that's the end of the story.
Absolutely, and this is the problem for me, is because when I picked up this story, there are a couple of things that I knew heading into this, and that I was going to try to reconcile. One is that anthropologists have known for a long time that the ghost dance did not end in 1890, that it went on for years afterwards, and that it spread far and wide, and it still has a wide influence. And so how do you reconcile, as a historian, how do you reconcile that with this story of everything ending at Wounded Knee? Was one of the things that I was very curious about. But the other thing that really jumped out at me when I began looking at the sources for what we know about the ghost dance. I mean, as a historian, right, your job is to investigate how we know what we think we know. Right? That is one of the things that you have to do. And everyone knows what the ghost dance taught. Every book that I pick up on the ghost dance spends very little time on that subject. And so I anticipated that when I wrote this book that I would be saying the same things about the actual ghost dance teachings as everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem was when I started to look at what Wovoka actually said in the work, for example, of James Mooney, that anthropologist who met with him in 1892.
Oh, Mooney. I think I said Moody earlier.
Oh, yeah, it's Mooney. Yeah, James Mooney, Irish-American anthropologist and a brilliant man, right? Self-taught, and a real genius in many ways. When he recorded what Wovoka said, when he wrote it down, he wrote all of the things that I said, that the believers have to be kind to one another, not lie, not steal, not make war, and to do this dance. But he also said, and they must work. And that Wovoka was very clear on this point. They must work for white men, which I took to mean working for dollars, because Wovoka himself both worked for ranchers and also cut and sold wood.
As a wage laborer, right?
As a wage laborer, yeah. And in fact, among Northern Paiute people in 1889, that was the only way to stay alive, was to be a wage laborer. And that this is part of living. And one of the things he's doing is teaching an ethic for survival in a terrible time of sort of industrialization of the high desert was a terrible time for native people. And so I got intrigued with that these teachings about that he's teaching people to labor. I mean, he wants the believers to labor.
That doesn't seem to fit with this idea of it being a wholly backwards looking religion that's looking to turn back the clock.
Right. It's I mean, I think that religions are always contradictory, right? And religions allow us to reconcile our contradictions. Mm-hmm. So if you are longing for a life without labor, right? If you believe that should be what the future is, either on this earth or in the afterlife, one of the things that not just the ghost dance, but other religions teach, in my experience, right, is that if you labor well in this life, at the end of history or at the end of your life, you will enter a world where there is no labor.
Yeah.
And thereby the contradiction is reconciled. That's how I interpret that kind of teaching, both in the ghost dance and it's not that different. That part of the teaching isn't that different from some of the teachings that, in Protestant Christianity. But on top of that, I have to say, on top of what Wovoka had to say about labor, I started to find sources where he said a great deal more along these lines, where he says that believers must send their children to school.
Yeah, to white American schools, right?
Yeah, because at this point, actually, on the reservations, particularly in South Dakota and on the plains, Native children are being taken off to boarding schools, or there are day schools going up as well. And Wovoka himself was a big believer in schooling for children. He sent his own children. A school opened in Carson City for Native children in 1890, a boarding school. He sent his own children and would actually go around trying to persuade other parents to send their children as well. In addition to sending your children to school and going to work, one of the things he says is you should cooperate with your agents, with the Indian agents who supervise the reservations. He says that you should go to church. And he says, all these churches are mine. And this I found really fascinating because among Northern Paiute people, there wasn't such a dispute about what Christian churches to belong to. Christian missionaries were very thin on the ground in northern Nevada in these years. But among the believers who came to listen to Wovoka from the northern plains, particularly Lakotas, there was a fierce contest going on between Lakotas and various different groups of missionaries, Protestants and Catholics, over what religion Native people should take up, whether it should be Protestant, whether it should be Catholic, or whether among many Lakotas, whether they could hang on to the old religion and stick with that. And what Wovoka says to them is, pick a church and go to it. It doesn't matter which one. But then you also will do these other things, and you will do this dance, and you will send your children to school. You will go to work. You will be kind to one another, and so forth. And we will restore the earth, and there will be a new world that is an Indian world. He makes that very clear, in which Indians will be free and have autonomy. And that the teachings then become. I mean, when I found these sources, the question becomes, what does this mean about the religion that Wovoka was saying these things, was saying to people, send your children to school, go to work. And what does that tell us about this religion, and how does it look different from what we thought? And it seems to me that one of the things he's trying to say is, if we do these things, the world will be renewed. The way that I'm talking about, right? The world will be renewed as a place of revived, be a revived Indian world. And it seems to me what he's saying is we can take up these things, schooling, wage work, and so forth, and yet remain Indian, remain native. We will not assimilate. We will accommodate, but we will not assimilate. And I think that that's part of the core of the teaching here is trying to, not in a way that is strategic. I don't think Wovoka's thinking about this strategically. I think he's revealing the teachings as he finds them in his visions, right? But I think the effect of it is that the ghost dance is a means of claiming an Indian identity, an Indian culture, in the midst of making all of these accommodations. Because if you go back and look at the discussions Native people are having in 1889 and 90, many of them are saying, what does it mean that we're, now we're freight drivers, we're teamsters, and we're not buffalo hunters, or we're not, we're not what we were before, and we're doing these things that white people do. Does this mean we're becoming white?
They're trying to figure out their own identities.
Absolutely. I mean, and there are huge arguments about this, right? The people saying, no, it doesn't. People say, yes, it does. And what Wovoka's saying is, no, you're going to do this labor as a native person, and you're going to reclaim your native earth by doing it.
This is those who are familiar with this, I think will immediately realize this is a pretty radical kind of, not necessarily introduction of radically different content, but a full reframing of kind of how we approach it. Many have told it as that there was such fervor and enthusiasm for this religion because it promised, a return to the old ways. Are you are arguing that's part of it. That's in the future, right? That there will be a renewal of the world, and bison will come back, and there will be these changes. But are you also arguing that it provided a pragmatic way for Native peoples to grapple with and enter into and participate in the modern world that they were having these debates about?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Did they see that? Is that why they were grabbing onto it? Because were they conscious of the way in which Wovoka was offering them an Indian passage into the modern world?
I think that different believers obviously took it up, right, for different reasons and in different ways. And let's be clear, right? This is a story of the ghost dance, but there are so many stories of the ghost dance that are experienced by believers in different ways. But I would say this, that there were many people who took up the faith anticipating that the end of the world was just around the corner. Mm-hmm. And they were very excited about this. They called, and there were problems in sort of reconciling the different teachings with one another for the believers. There were challenges in doing that. So, for example, at Pine Ridge, the believers' children, overwhelmingly left the schools to go join the dance circles. But when they were asked about this, the believers said, well, we're told to send our children to school, and school's a good thing. They would say that. But we're also told to take our children to church. And this is our church. This religion is our church. So, and the Messiah is coming. I mean, the teachings were that an Indian Messiah would come, right? When the fulfillment of all of the prophecies had been achieved, an Indian Messiah would come to usher in this new world. And they would say, he's on his way. And we need to be there. We need to be ready. So in many ways, let me do this. I am wary of comparing religions to each other because they're so different, right? Religions across cultures, very different things. But think for a minute about Christianity and about Protestant Christianity. And let's just think about white people for a minute, white believers in the 19th century or even now, right? There are any number of Christian denominations, Methodists, right, Baptists, it come to mind immediately, right, who've had fervent revivals in the past and in the very recent past. But if we go back to the 19th century, there are huge revivals that sweep entire regions, and people in those revivals convinced that Jesus is coming momentarily. He's about to arrive. And the teachings that they live by day to day, right, about working hard, about being neighborly, about caring for one another, and about following the Ten Commandments and all of those things, those are one set of teachings. And when the revival reaches its peak, though, and the belief is that Jesus is about to arrive, people will often stop going to work, right? They stop plowing their fields. They get caught up in the enthusiasm and in the ecstasy of it. And we don't consider these contradictory behaviors at all, right? When we think about the history of Christianity, that's part of the whole package of Christianity, right? That you can have one set of teachings which is for day to day, but then in the height of religious ecstasy and enthusiasm, some of those teachings might be temporarily set aside, at least because people believe the end is near. This happened with the ghost dance too. Mm-hmm. And it certainly happened. It happened at Pine Ridge, and it happened at a few other places. It happens on the southern plains in Oklahoma among the southern Arapaho. There's also a huge amount of enthusiasm and circles turning for hours, right, at a time, and people dancing long into the night, right, dancing all night long. Those kinds of behaviors, I would say, people had, when they got in the dance circle and people were dancing, they would often dance until they collapsed, at least in South Dakota among Lakota people, and also among Southern Arapahoes in Oklahoma. The dancers would then wake up from these, from after they collapsed, they would awaken and talk about the visions they had in which they had traveled in the afterlife and had seen this new world that was coming, and their deceased relatives, their many of these people, right, all of these people had lost so many of their relatives to sickness and war, and many mothers saw their deceased children, and so many began to see deceased children in their visions that parents who had lost children carried toys into the dance circle as gifts for the spirits of their children they were sure they would encounter. Uh-huh. The sense of joy and sorrow combined in those kinds of moments, right, where people are, there's account after account after account of ghost dancers joining the circle, being very skeptical, saying, I didn't think this was true, but I thought I should try it because I lost my brother. And they would say, and I miss my brother and I want to see him. And then they would. Now, not everybody would. Some people would get into the circle and dance and say, it didn't work for me. Yeah. But there was this wide enthusiasm for this experience on the plains. Now, among Northern Paiute people, Wovoka had visions, but there are not accounts of dancers having those kinds of visions. It was the experience seems to change out on the plains. Something different is going on.
So we need to recognize the diversity of experience.
Yeah, the religion is never just one thing. I have had people ask me, why is it called a religion? Isn't that a Western way of understanding native spirituality? And obviously, to some degree, that term is West. I mean, it is a Western term, right? But I would say this: you can certainly call the ghost dance a spiritual practice, a ceremonial practice. You call it any number of things. But the believers at the time would make it very clear to their interlocutors, to white people and to others who asked them, that this was a church and that this was a religion and that it was on a par with any of the religions the white people were bringing. Mm-hmm. And I think that was part of the point. Yeah, was they had become accustomed to missionaries fighting with each other over who was right about Christianity. There were terrible feuds between Catholic and Protestant missionaries on many reservations. And to Native people, as they watched these people fight with each other over how to worship Christ, right? What they took away from that in many cases was, well, there's more than one way to worship our Creator, obviously. And all we're doing is worshiping our Creator in our own way.
Yeah.
And claiming a validity for it on those terms. I see this in the book. I argue this is part of that process in which Native people come to claim Native religion as having at least equal standing with any Western religions and deserving of the same constitutional protections. Now, they don't say that in the Ghost Dance moment. They're not yet invoking the First Amendment.
But the legacy, they do later, and their legacies,
Absolutely. They do later.
What's fascinating here is that when you read accounts, as these white observers are watching the dances and things, they speak about them almost exclusively in kind of these terms of the savages dancing, and they don't offer any kind of validity to this religious experience, when in many of their own religious traditions' histories, you go back, like as you said, go back to the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, and there's remarkable parallels here to expressions of religious experience that are given room in these Christian traditions, but
absolutely,
but not for Native. And that was something that I had not previously considered.
Yes, and it's one of those things where if you put, I mean, again, we have to be very careful comparing religions across cultures. Right? We got to be very careful about that. But if you put do a history of religious revivals in the United States, and you start to put Native revivals in that narrative, in that grand story of all of these different revivals, what's that look like? How are these things connected? And obviously they're very different, but how are they connected? And you'll find they are connected in many cases. I mean, one of the things you asked me about, were there people who thought of the ghost dance as a pragmatic way forward? And I think there were many people who valued the ghost dance for its pragmatism. Among them, there were a large number of graduates of boarding schools, Indian boarding schools, Carlisle Indian School and several others, who became ghost dancers on the plains. And this is something that at the time observers simply refused to see. Not all observers. Mooney noticed it and wrote about it, but others would say, well, the ghost dance it's people who are refusing to move forward and trying to hang on to the old ways. And it's the old timers. The educated people will have nothing to do with it. And that's simply not true. Many of the leaders of the ghost dance on the Southern Plains were boarding school graduates. And I think for them, these people have been exposed to a lot of religious teaching, a lot of Christian teaching. Some of them, I'm sure, had seen religious revivals among white people, and how those religious revivals passed through white communities. And when the ghost dance came to the Southern Plains, there were a good many people who had come back to the reservation from boarding school and had faced their own set of challenges, because they're trained at boarding school to be things like shoemakers or bakers or wheelwrights. And there's simply no work at the reservation for the skills that they have. Right?
We often talk about how they're caught between two worlds.
Right.
So is the ghost dance a way for them to kind of reconcile, or to?
I think so.
To negotiate these problems of having received this education and then back on the reservation and not sure where they fit or how to make things fit together.
Yeah, and one of the things that they face coming back to the reservation is they've missed out on because they've been away so many years. They missed out on the ceremonial education they would normally get as they grew up, right? You come back to the reservation, and if you become a ghost dancer and you are actually, as happened to happened to a number of boarding school graduates, they become visionaries. That is, they're having these powerful visions of their ancestors and of the world, the afterworld, and so forth, that actually seem to affect other people, and that other people can believe in their visions as well. when you have that you come back into this moment and there's this new religion and you have standing in that new religion, and it is an Indian religion, right? It helps bridge some of this gap between the school leavers, or the school graduates, I should say, and the people who didn't go to school. And there's a considerable social gap there. Mm-hmm. That the ghost dance, I think, allows all of these people to get into the circle together, and to worship together is a way.
Powerful.
Yeah, it's a very powerful community sort of orienting religion, and that's certainly the case too up at Pine Ridge and at Rosebud among Lakotas, and in the other Lakota reservations too, Cheyenne River, for example, and at Standing Rock, you find that there are a good many Lakotas who've been going to Christian churches by 1889. There are a good many who've been going. Estimates are all over the place, but some people say as many as half the people had been going to these Christian churches, and half had not. Right. And one of the things you find in the ghost dance moment is that a lot of the people who are refusing Christian teachings take up the ghost dance, but a lot of the people who identify themselves as Christians, Lakotas who identify themselves as Christians, also take up the ghost dance, and some of them defend it as being a Christian ritual. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think all ghost dancers believed it was a Christian ritual, not at all. I mean, there's good evidence that some said, no, this is a different Messiah, right? But the fact is you could get Christians and non-Christians in the same circle, holding hands and dancing together, because it was a circle that alternated men and women around this whole circle, and everyone would hold hands. That all being together, I think, signifies that in some ways this belief allows people to reclaim their community across these increasingly problematic religious lines that had been imposed on them with colonialism, right? With the coming of the missionaries, and that kind of missionization of the reservations was really tearing the communities apart by this time. And the ghost dance is kind of a healing moment.
Wow. And I don't know if that speaks to why, I'm sure it speaks to why reservation agents felt threatened by it, not just because they were, even though, some thought, oh, this is a war dance and they're getting a rebellion together, and others are saying, no, it's clearly not that. A reinvigorated and strengthened Native community is, I wonder, implicitly threatening to, especially to assimilationist goals and those that
were,
and so forth.
I mean, assimilation is a full bore government policy at this time, right? And the idea of assimilation is you're supposed to get rid of Indian religion altogether, and they're going to become just Christians who look and dress like everyone else and plow the plains as farmers, and that will be that. This was another thing I don't think I mentioned, by the way. The ghost dance, actually, the teachings of the ghost dance include, Jack Wilson Wovoka says, get yourselves farms to live on.
Oh yeah, buy farms, own property.
Yeah.
That's the. I mean, I wrote down one quote here. And here's the grand irony is that in many ways, the religion was answering so many of the things that assimilationists were hoping would occur, right?
Yeah.
And you write that speaking of the victims of Wounded Knee, you said these are people who sallied forth courageously into the future to do the things that white people demanded.
Yeah.
But the caveat you say, but without becoming who they demanded, right? Without becoming white. And we can argue about whether or not they were ever going to be allowed to fully integrate and become white anyways, because plenty of examples, this prime among them of attempts to do all the things they were being asked, were met with without open arms.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the one of the things that when you try to look at the challenges Native communities are facing in that moment of the 1880s, right? And where it's clear that armed resistance is no longer possible. That's long gone by this time, right? It's among Lakotas who were some of the last to keep up the armed resistance. Right, it's over by 1877, and even Sitting Bull has come to the reservation. He back from Canada by 1881. So there's when they look around and say, well, what do we do now? Right? I mean, it's not that hard to understand their logic. They say things like, well, if you look at these white people, they have an awful lot of power. They have an awful lot of wealth, and they seem to be farming. So maybe we got to try that.
Yeah.
Right. We'll try it out. They say we got to send our kids to school. And this is a terribly difficult thing to do. But a lot of people, a lot of parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles who are responsible for educating the next generation would say, well, we do need to try this. Right. And they're willing to give it a try. And the ghost dance, I think, it is in the teachings of the ghost dance, in those teachings where Wovoka is saying, look, you have to do these things as well as, this dance and this code of behavior, includes things like that these reservation agents want us to do. My sense of why the reservation agents, the superintendents of all these reservations couldn't actually see this as something positive, has to do with, there are various things here. One is that the religion in various places, particularly in South Dakota, was led by the old holy men, the holy men of the old religion. And when I say old, they're not that old. They're in their 40s, most of them, which would make them at that time probably grandfathers. So they were elders by that time. But these guys many of them had been with Crazy Horse and with Sitting Bull, had fought Custer at Little Bighorn, and were associated with the so-called non-progressive element on the reservation. And these guys became leading ghost dance teachers. Now, we know that they said the same things that we've been talking about, that Wovoka says. We know that what they taught often included things like, you will send your children to school and take up farming. There's other eyewitness accounts of those that are written down. But
they're suspect, right?
They're suspect. And quite often, in South Dakota, at Pine Ridge in particular, there's such a fight going on between agents who are demanding total submission of the old holy men and the old tribal leaders, and different groups of native people who are trying to chart a way forward. It's very hard for agents to get good information about what's actually going on with the ghost dance, and it's very rare for them to want to hear what's actually going on. The striking thing about that moment, when you read through the sources, is the degree to which authorities had already made up their mind what this religion was. The moment it even before it appeared, when they heard rumors of it, they immediately anticipated it's a rebellion in the making.
Yeah, they had a narrative.
Yeah,
and they
it's a
in that
conspiracy.
narrative. And even when they're told the opposite, they don't believe it. And there are a fair number of other people who will attest to the truth of their beliefs. That is, there are allies of Indian agents who are in the police or who are also native, right? Who will tell them, these ghost dancers are up to no good. And there are people who will do that to get for their own political reasons. And in the end, the result of this, of course, is that the army ends up coming to the reservation, and then you have the army doing police work, and it's on the reservation, and it's a disaster. Yeah, we see how that ends.
Absolute catastrophe, right? But yes, the people, all along I find in the sources people who are trying to explain the ghost dance. Believers who are trying to explain the ghost dance to non-believers, to white authorities, by emphasizing its pragmatism, and what a good force this can be for Native people. They get nowhere usually. I should say too, there are a handful of white people who do see this. I think Mooney gets some things wrong, particularly in South Dakota, but he does say that this religion did a powerful lot of good on most of the reservations where it appeared. It helped people reconcile themselves to reservation life and to kind of trying to move forward to a new kind of future that they hadn't anticipated before. He says that. And there are observers. There's a guy who writes to the Army saying, I've been reading in the papers here in Chicago about this religion, and why don't you guys just leave it alone? It sounds to me like a camp meeting. And can't the Indians have camp meetings? And there are people like that, but they are few and far between. Most people who read the newspapers, right? Most of the Army, the vast majority of the Army, and of course the Indian agents in the Indian office, they all have this old colonial narrative in their heads that we know it from the movies, right? The sound of drums in the distance, right? The Indians are dancing. That's supposed to mean trouble, and that is an old narrative, colonial narrative that takes place. I mean, that takes a grip here.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the time that this vanishing Indian, the sense of the vanishing Indian going in, and I don't know if I read this in your book, but I believe it was Suzette LaFlèche who, and I don't remember what newspaper in Omaha she was reporting for, but I think I remember reading that she had came back and said to her editors, this is not a violent movement, and the editors, in one way or another said, that's not what our readers want to read.
Yeah.
Our readers want to read stories about that reaffirms their idea of a vanishing Indian, or they want to read about a war.
Yeah. And they want to read about war so that they know why Indians have to vanish.
Yeah, it justifies that.
Yeah.
As they're wringing their hands and lamenting it, it also then provides kind of a justification. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Well, I wanted to turn to one, and we can't keep listeners too long. One of the other things that struck me throughout this book, I know we've already talked a lot about modernity and so forth, but if you were to ask me, how are these ghost dance evangelists traveling around? In my head, I pictured natives on horseback and so forth. Even though if you had said that, but Brenden, it's 1890. Yeah. So how are they communicating? How are they traveling? I was shocked at how strong just kind of these preconceived notions of natives being a relic of the past and being on horseback. But of course, they're communicating by telegraph and the U.S. Postal Service, and they're traveling on rail. Yeah. And as I was reading through these, as you were kind of talking about how they used very modern technologies and so forth to spread the religion, I said, well, of course they did. And I had to pause and realize just how pervasive just some of these stereotypes of 19th century in Indians were, even in me.
Right.
It kind of shocked me. And then you also bring, even at Wounded Knee, the violence is often the triggering moment is often a black coyote, is how it's told, right? As he's not wanting to give up his gun,
right?
And you note that he wasn't. It's not because he just wanted to keep his gun, but he wanted to be paid for it.
Yeah, he said, I paid good money for this gun, and nobody's taken it unless they pay me first.
Right, so it wasn't it wasn't a backwards-looking Indian just wanting to hold on to his weapon. It was a very modern Indian saying, well, but I want cash.
Yeah, and your government's taken my stuff, they got to pay me for it.
Yeah, and these Miniconjus, as they're fleeing, they're all concerned about, but what about my farm? Is someone going to ransack it? Is my property going to be protected? What about the hay that we were just gathering up? Like these are all natives participating in modern economies and modern technologies. And of the many takeaways I had from this book, that was something that made me pause repeatedly and is now making me kind of rethink a number of native topics that I'm familiar with and saying, I need to reconsider how I'm framing these in my mind, especially as we get to kind of this turn of the century era.
Right. Right.
And I don't know if you set out to have that be one of the big takeaways for the book, but that's something that struck me again and again.
Well, this is, I mean, certainly when I was, the first time I ever went through Walker River, which is where the prophecies come from, and realized that there was, that this was where the prophecies emerged, and this was the place of the prophet. When you get there, it's on a state highway, but it really doesn't feel like, I mean, it feels like a lot of people say, well, it feels like the middle of nowhere, and it's not. I mean, there are communities there are people living there, but it does feel like you are in the, like, how did this religion that had such an impact, how did it come from here? How did people find out about it? And it really is fascinating how the networks of Native communication in that era work. I mean, there's a lot of visiting going on between Indian peoples from one reservation to another. And the story is usually that the Bannock people from Idaho, from what's now near Pocatello, came down on the train and were visiting relatives among northern Paiutes there at Walker River, and saw these dances and heard about these prophecies and took them back to Idaho. And there at Fort Hall, the reservation at Fort Hall attracted customarily a lot of people from the plains and from the Rockies would go there. And Lakotas find out about it there. And Arapahoes, northern Arapahoes are up near there. The religion moves over to Wind River, Wyoming, with northern Arapahoes. And from there it goes down to southern Arapahoes in Oklahoma and over to Lakotas. And it goes up to Montana, to northern Cheyenne. It goes all over, but it doesn't just go. It's people moving and taking the teachings with them. So yeah, my question when I started was, one of them was, how did they do all this? And they get on the train. And
how else would they, right?
Yeah. I mean, they sometimes, it depends, but different Indian tribal nations had agreements with railroads, that in return for easements to build the railroads across reservations, they could sometimes travel for free.
I found this in my research,
northern Paiutes
individuals having passes.
Yeah, right. And my sense of this was that by the time the religion was reaching its peak, and you had hundreds of Indian men and women coming down from the plains to Walker River on the train, that train that they were riding from Reno down to Walker River, there was an easement. Northern Paiutes were allowed to ride that train for free. And all of these accounts of Native people, there are a few of them who say, it was amazing. Everyone on the train was so nice to us, by which I think they mean nobody demanded money while they were on that train. And it's just one of these things where sometimes they're getting money together and buying tickets, and other times they don't have to, because they're traveling on a train where there's this agreement between Indian people and the railroad, and the conductors simply aren't collecting tickets from Indian people. And so it's a really fascinating kind of world in which there are a lot of Indians on the train. And I've seen evidence before where different white people would try to pass themselves off as Indians in order not to pay for their train ticket. Yeah, in fact, railroads complained about this.
I think we need a book about Native Railroad.
Yeah, and I know someone who's actually working on.
Well, there we go. That's great.
Yeah, a dissertation actually. Yeah, and so there's that's part of it. The other thing is just that, as you say, there are a lot of graduates of boarding schools who go along on these journeys to record the teachings, and they write them down, and they send them through the mail to people at other reservations. The U.S. Postal Service plays a big role in the ghost dance, as does the telegraph.
Yeah.
The telegraph plays a huge role in suppressing the ghost dance. I mean, the Army uses it, Indian agents use it, critics of the ghost dance among Native people, and there are Native people who don't believe in the ghost dance and who begin to criticize it, also use these tools to try to fight against the ghost dance. But all of these tools are very useful for the believers. And in a lot of ways, again, this sort of speaks to the utility of the ghost dance, or the meaning of the ghost dance as a modern religion for these people. And I think it is a religion that's spread partly through all of these modern conveniences, as you mentioned.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, I think we might be about out of time. I want to thank you for not just writing on this topic, but you write with a sensitivity and an empathy that I found quite striking. I mean, and you wax philosophic at some point, trying to point out how better understanding this, should influence how we understand current events and world religions today and different peoples. And I think the tone in which you write goes a long way to accomplishing that, or at least to pointing us into directions and where we can have more productive dialogue today as well. So I definitely appreciated that.
Well, thank you very much, Brenden, and for that. And I should say that I learned a huge amount in doing this book from native friends and consultants who helped me out along the way. It's not a book in which I didn't collect oral histories. I was working from a documentary record just from 1889 and 90. But my old friend Arthur Amiot up in South Dakota was a huge help to me in understanding how the ghost dance is situated within Lakota tradition. And Marlon Thompson over at Walker River, he's the tribal historian for the Yarrington Paiute tribe. He was a gigantic help to me in sort of coming to understand some of the things that Wovoka was saying and how that relates to Northern Paiute belief and spirituality. And then Roderick Sweezy in Oklahoma, who helped me enormously in thinking about the ghost dance and its relation to Southern Arapaho tradition. And all of these people in going through these materials that myself, I was learning a lot, but then being able to go talk to these people, to my teachers, was immensely helpful, and I want to thank them.
Well, I think their influence definitely comes through in the text.
Thank you.
Quickly, if we have, say we have 30 seconds here, what's next for you?
Oh, that's always the question, right? I tend to go off in radically different directions. There is a short book I would like to do about one of the figures in this book, a short treatment of Short Bull, who's one of the evangelists, who's also an artist.
We actually didn't get to him, but one of the more interesting stories that readers should look for.
Yeah, he's and so I'm thinking about doing something short about him, a shorter book. But then I'm looking at some writing on California. Writing a book on the making of modern California. It's sort of taking me in a completely different direction. But how California has sort of become a world power is one of the subjects I'm interested in. I've also got an abiding interest in Rachel Carson, and I'm working on some things on Rachel Carson. So one of these I'm going to pick as my major project here at the next, very shortly, because I've got the next year off, and I'll be working on that. But these things always take me a while.
Well, I hope Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Wright Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University.
Yeah, well, thank you, and I hope
Rensink,
it won't take 10 years, but you never know.
Host, producer, and engineer.
Well,
pretty much
thanks for
else
taking
the
some time to join
so if you
us.
have any praise or critique, I guess you can probably send
thanks so much. Thank you, Brenden.
I also
It's been a
serve here at the
pleasure.
Red Center as the
Take care.
assistant
You too.
director and as an assistant professor in the Department of History. So please contact me if you have any questions, not just about the podcast, but about the Red Center, our events, our funding, or anything else. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. You can find him at micahdalanderson.com. That's Micah, D-A-H-L, Anderson with an O.com. I'll go ahead and include a link in the episode description. If you live here in the Intermountain West, let me also mention our digital public history project, Intermountain Histories. You can visit it at intermountainhistories.org or download the free mobile app by searching for Intermountain Histories on your Apple or Android devices. With this website and free mobile app, you can explore and read carefully curated histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. Each is researched and written by students and professors at universities around the region. Otherwise, please subscribe to the podcast or follow us on Facebook or Twitter to receive notification when the next episode goes live. We have many more fascinating conversations on the horizon and hope that you'll join us.